Don't touch that. You can't afford it. The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and clean, slicing through the quiet hum of soft jazz and polished marble inside the showroom. The diamonds didn't sparkle the same after that. They just watched. Darius Coleman stood still in the center of the store, one hand hovering inches above a glass display filled with white gold bracelets, each tagged in neat script. $18, $500, $26,000, $42,750. Numbers that meant something to everyone in the room except him. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn. He just let the sentence land, settle, and expose exactly what it was meant to do. Around him, the air shifted. Conversations paused. A couple near the engagement ring section glanced over, unsure if they'd heard it right. The woman behind the counter, blonde, late 30s, posture tight with practiced authority, folded her arms like she'd just enforced a rule that didn't need explaining. Her name tag read Clara, but her tone didn't need one. It carried something older than policy. Darius slowly lowered his hand, not out of compliance, but out of control. He moved like someone who understood timing better than emotion. The bracelet remained exactly where it was, untouched now, as if the moment had marked it. He turned slightly, enough for the light above to catch the calm in his face. No anger, no embarrassment, just recognition. He had seen this before. Not here. Not this exact room with its custom Italian lighting and $3 million in insured inventory. But the energy, he knew it well. It was the same look he got at 19 when a security guard followed him through a mall store like he was a question waiting to be answered. The same tone at 24 when a sales associate told him a watch was probably out of his range before he even asked the price. The same quiet dismissal wrapped in polite words, delivered like a favor. And now, standing in a flagship location on Fifth Avenue, inside a store that generated 6 figures a day, it had found him again. Only this time, it felt different. Not because the words had changed, but because he had. Clara stepped closer, her heels tapping lightly against the floor, each step measured, rehearsed. "Sir," she said again, softer now, but no less firm. "We ask that customers only handle items with assistance." The correction came dressed as professionalism, but the room had already heard the first version. Darius tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the cases, the layout, the staff positions. 3 employees on the floor. 1 security guard near the entrance pretending not to listen. A manager's office in the back, glass door half open. He noticed everything. He always did. "Is that your policy?" he asked quietly, his voice even, almost curious. "Or your assumption?" The question didn't rise. It didn't challenge. It simply existed, placed carefully between them like another item in the case. Clara hesitated for half a second, just enough to register that this wasn't going the way she expected. Then she smiled. Not warm, not welcoming, controlled. "It's our standard," she replied. "We maintain a certain level of clientele experience." There it was. Not said directly. Never said directly. But everyone heard it. A man near the register shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his jacket as if the temperature had changed. Somewhere behind Darius, a phone camera lifted slightly, subtle but intentional. Someone was watching now. Darius nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something only he understood. "A standard," he repeated. The words sounded different coming from him. He glanced back at the bracelet for a moment, then at Clara, then at the rest of the store. His silence stretched just long enough to make people lean into it. Not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't chase it. And that made it heavier. From the back office, movement. The glass door opened wider, and a man stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked. Ethan Whitmore, store manager, early 40s, tailored suit, silver watch, posture built on authority that had never really been tested. He scanned the room quickly, eyes landing on Darius, then Clara, then the small cluster of attention forming around them. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew enough. He approached with a calm that bordered on rehearsed, inserting himself into the space like a solution. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, voice smooth, controlled, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began. Clara exhaled slightly, relieved. "He was handling merchandise without assistance," she said, her tone shifting just enough to sound justified. Ethan nodded, then looked at Darius, measuring him in a single glance. Clothes first. Hoodie. Sneakers. No visible watch. No obvious signals. The conclusion formed instantly. Sir, Ethan said, stepping closer, we're happy to assist you if you're interested in purchasing. Otherwise, we do ask that you refrain from interacting with items directly. The words were polite. The message wasn't. Darius met his gaze, unblinking. And if I am interested, he asked. Ethan's smile didn't change, but something behind it tightened. Then we can guide you to pieces that fit your needs, he replied. Fit your needs. The phrase hung there, coded, familiar. A quiet line drawn in the middle of a luxury space. Darius let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. You've already decided what those are, he said. Not a question. A statement. Ethan's expression held, but the room felt it shift. The balance was moving, slowly, almost invisibly. A woman near the entrance whispered something to her partner. The phone in the back lifted a little higher now. Clara crossed her arms again, defensive without realizing it. Ethan adjusted his stance, reclaiming space. We're trying to maintain the integrity of the store, he said. Darius nodded again. Always calm. Always measured. By deciding who belongs in it, he replied. Silence. Not empty. Charged. It pressed against the walls, against the glass, against every person pretending not to be part of it. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. He wasn't used to resistance that didn't escalate. This kind of calm, it didn't give him anything to push against. So he changed tactics. If you're not making a purchase, he said, voice firmer now, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the display. There it was. The shift from suggestion to instruction. From service to control. Darius didn't move. Not immediately. He looked at the bracelet one more time, then at Ethan, then around the store again, as if committing the moment to memory. And maybe he was. Because this wasn't just happening. It was being recorded, by phones, by eyes, by something deeper than either. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, pulling out his phone. Not in defiance. Not dramatically. Just purposefully. Ethan watched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Clara straightened, unsure now if the situation was escalating or slipping. The security guard shifted his weight. The phone in the back steadied, focused. Darius unlocked the screen, tapped once, then lifted his eyes back to Ethan. Let's make this simple, he said, voice still calm, still level, but carrying something new. Now, not anger, not frustration, something heavier, something final. And in that moment, without raising his voice, without moving an inch closer, the entire room felt it. The balance wasn't shifting anymore. It was about to flip. The silence did not break when Darius spoke. It deepened. It stretched across the showroom like a held breath no one wanted to release first. His phone rested calmly in his hand, screen lit but unreadable from where Ethan stood, and yet somehow it carried more weight than anything else in the room. Ethan Whitmore adjusted his stance again, subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The kind of adjustment that only happens when certainty begins to slip. Simple, Ethan repeated, his tone steady but thinner now, like glass under pressure. Then let us keep it that way. If you are not making a purchase, we will ask you to leave. The words were clear, final, designed to close the situation. But Darius did not move. Not forward. Not back. He simply looked at Ethan as if measuring the distance between who he thought he was and what he was about to become in the next few minutes. Around them, the store no longer felt like a place for transactions. It felt like a stage that no one had planned, but everyone had suddenly become part of. The customer with the phone shifted closer, not hiding it anymore. A quiet recording. Not for attention. For truth. Clara's confidence had begun to thin at the edges. She glanced toward Ethan, waiting for him to take control again, to end it the way he always did. With authority. With certainty. But something about Darius made that harder than usual. He was not defensive. He was not loud. He was not asking for anything. And that made him unpredictable. I am making a purchase, Darius said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational. Ethan's expression flickered. Then we can assist you at the appropriate level. He replied quickly, regaining some ground. There is no need for this to become disruptive. Disruptive. The word landed differently than the others. It carried blame without saying it. It suggested that the problem was not what had happened, but who had not accepted it quietly. Darius nodded slowly. Appropriate level, he repeated. You have said that twice now. Ethan held his gaze. Because it matters, he said. Darius tilted his head slightly, as if considering that. It does, he agreed. Another pause. Another shift. The rhythm of the room was no longer controlled by Ethan. It had changed hands without anyone announcing it. Darius lowered his eyes briefly to his phone and tapped once. A soft, almost silent action, but it echoed in the tension that followed. Then he lifted his gaze again. "Let us test your standard," he said. Clara frowned, confusion breaking through her composure. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sir, I am not sure what you think this is," he began. "No." Darius interrupted gently, not raising his voice, just redirecting the moment. "You are sure? That is the problem." The words did not attack. They revealed, and that made them harder to dismiss. A man near the engagement section took a step closer, drawn in despite himself. A woman beside him whispered, "This is not going to end the way they think." Darius continued, his tone steady, controlled, every word placed with intention. "You saw me walk in," he said. "You saw what I was wearing. You saw what I was not wearing. And before I said a single word, you made a decision." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Darius did not stop. "You decided I did not belong in this space. You decided what I could afford. You decided what level I deserved. And now you are calling it standard." Clara shifted uncomfortably. The word now felt heavier than before. "Not a rule. A reflection." Ethan's voice hardened slightly. "We follow procedures," he said. "Procedures do not look at people," Darius replied. "People do." Silence again. But this time it was not just tension. It was recognition. Something in the room had clicked into place. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The security guard near the entrance lowered his gaze, no longer pretending this was routine. The customer recording steadied their hand. The moment was no longer small. Darius lifted his phone slightly, not to show anything, just enough to make it part of the space between them. "So here's what we are going to do," he said. Ethan's confidence wavered for the first time in a way that could not be hidden. "There is nothing to do," he replied quickly. "You are either purchasing or you are leaving." Darius shook his head once, slow, almost patient. "No," he said. "There is something to do. You are going to watch." The words landed differently. Not as a threat, not as a command, as certainty. Ethan frowned. "Watch what?" he asked. Darius's eyes did not leave his. "What happens when your assumption meets reality?" The room held that sentence like it was waiting for something to follow. And then, from somewhere deeper in the store, a soft chime. Not loud, not dramatic, but out of place. It came from behind the counter. Clara turned instinctively toward the system terminal. The screen flickered. Once. Then again. A notification appeared. She leaned in, confusion replacing authority completely now. "Ethan," she said quietly, uncertainty clear in her voice. Ethan did not look at her immediately. He was still watching Darius, trying to hold on to control that was slipping through something he could not yet see. "What is it?" he asked, irritation creeping in. Clara hesitated. "There is a system alert," she said. "Ownership registry access. Store 14. The words hung in the air like something fragile. Ethan turned sharply toward her now. "That is not possible," he said. Clara swallowed, eyes still fixed on the screen. "It is already running," she replied. The customer with the phone stepped even closer now, no longer hiding anything. The moment had shifted again. Not just emotionally. Structurally. Something behind the scenes had been set in motion, and everyone in the room could feel it even if they did not understand it yet. Darius stood exactly where he had been from the beginning. No movement. No urgency. Just presence. Like someone who had already seen the ending and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Ethan looked back at him, the first real crack in his confidence visible now. "What did you do?" he asked. Darius's expression did not change. "Nothing," he said calmly. "I just stopped letting you decide who I am." And somewhere between that sentence and the quiet glow of the system screen behind the counter, the balance that had once belonged to Ethan Whitmore disappeared completely. The screen behind the counter did not just flicker anymore. It stabilized, sharp and undeniable, casting a cold light across Clara's face as she stared at it like it had suddenly learned how to speak. The system was no longer idle. It was active, pulling data, verifying, exposing. Lines of information scrolled with quiet authority, the kind that did not need volume. To command attention, Clara's hands hovered above the keyboard, unsure whether to touch anything or leave it exactly as it was. "Ethan," she said again, but this time her voice carried something new. Not confusion, not doubt, Recognition. Ethan stepped closer to the counter. Faster now, his earlier composure thinning into urgency. Move, he said under his breath, positioning himself in front of the terminal as if proximity could restore control. His eyes scanned the screen quickly, searching for something familiar, something that confirmed he was still in charge of this space. But the system did not respond to his expectations. It responded to something else, something higher. The words were clear. Store identification, 14. Ownership verification in progress. Primary holder, loading. Ethan swallowed, a small motion that did not go unnoticed. Around him, the air shifted again, heavier now, like the room itself understood what was about to surface. The customer recording took another step closer, no longer pretending this was just curiosity. It was documentation now, a moment that mattered. Darius had not moved, not a single step. He stood exactly where he had been since the beginning, hands relaxed at his sides, phone still in his grip, his presence steady like a fixed point in a room that was starting to tilt. His eyes rested on Ethan, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. Ethan glanced back at him, just for a second, as if trying to measure what he had missed. But there was no time for that anymore. The screen refreshed. Once, then again, and then it stopped. Primary holder, Darius Coleman. Title, founder and majority owner. Access level, executive override. The words did not shout. They did not flash. They simply appeared, clean and undeniable, and in doing so, they rearranged everything in the room. Clara stepped back instinctively, her hand covering her mouth for a brief moment before she caught herself. The confidence she had worn earlier dissolved completely, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "Oh my God," she whispered, not to anyone, but to the truth sitting right in front of her. Ethan did not speak. He stared at the screen, eyes locked, as if staring long enough would rewrite it. But the system did not blink. It did not apologize. It did not adjust itself to protect his version of events. It simply remained accurate, and that accuracy was louder than anything he could say. Behind them, the quiet murmur of the customers began to rise. Not chaotic, not loud, just enough to signal that the moment had broken open. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "He owns this place," another voice answered, disbelief and realization mixing in equal measure. The phone capturing everything steadied even more, framing Darius now, not as a subject of suspicion, but as the center of something far larger. Darius took a single step forward. Not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance that had once been used to keep him out. The movement was small, but it carried weight. It marked the moment where presence turned into authority. Ethan finally turned to face him fully, his expression no longer controlled. It was searching now, trying to find footing in a situation that no longer followed his rules. "There must be some mistake," he said, the words coming out faster than he intended. It was not a question. It was a defense. Darius shook his head slightly. "No," he said, calm as ever. "There is not." The simplicity of the answer made it heavier. Ethan glanced back at the screen again, then at Clara, as if hoping someone else would interrupt the reality unfolding in front of him. But Clara did not move. She could not. She was no longer part of the authority in the room. She was part of the audience now. The security guard near the entrance straightened, his posture shifting subtly from enforcement to observation. He understood what had changed. Everyone did. Darius stepped closer to the counter, his reflection briefly catching in the glass display beneath the diamonds that had once been placed just out of reach for him. Now they reflected something different. Not exclusion. Ownership. He placed his phone gently on the counter, not as a gesture of power, but as a closing of the loop that had started this entire moment. "You asked me to leave," he said, his voice steady, each word clear. "In a store I built." The sentence landed with precision. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. For the first time since he walked onto the floor, he had no immediate response. No policy to quote. No standard to hide behind. Just the weight of his own decisions, now fully visible. Darius continued, not rushing, not pressing, just letting the truth unfold at its own pace. "You decided who I was before I said a word," he said. "You decided what I could afford. You decided what level I belonged to." Each sentence built on the last, not in volume, but in clarity. The room listened. Not because they were told to, because they recognized it. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in them no longer supported by certainty. "We did not know," he said finally, the words fragile now, stripped of their earlier authority. Darius met his gaze, unshaken. "That is the point," he replied. Silence followed, but this time it was not tense. It was revealing. It exposed everything that had been hidden behind tone, behind policy, behind assumption. Clara lowered her eyes, unable to hold the moment any longer. The customer recording did not move at all, capturing every second as it unfolded. Darius glanced briefly at the screen behind the counter one more time, then back at Ethan. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was," he said. "The problem is how you treated me when you thought I did not matter." The words settled into the room like something permanent. Not just for Ethan, for everyone. And in that moment, the jewelry store stopped being just a place of luxury and became something else entirely. A mirror. One that showed exactly what had been there all along, waiting for someone to stand still long enough for it to be seen. No one clapped. Not yet. The room was not ready for that. What filled the space instead was something heavier, something quieter, something that forced every person standing there to sit with what had just happened. The kind of silence that does not ask for permission to exist. It simply takes over. Ethan Whitmore stood behind the counter, but the position no longer meant anything. The space that once gave him authority now exposed him. His reflection in the glass looked smaller, not physically, but in certainty. His hands, which had once rested comfortably on polished surfaces, now hovered slightly, unsure where to belong. "Mr. Coleman," he began, the name sounding unfamiliar in his mouth, like something he should have recognized sooner but did not. Darius did not interrupt him. He did not need to. He simply watched, allowing Ethan the space to step into the truth he had avoided just minutes ago. "There was a misunderstanding," Ethan continued, trying to rebuild control with language that no longer held weight. "If we had known." "You keep saying that," Darius said calmly, his voice steady, cutting through the explanation without raising itself. "If you had known." The phrase echoed softly, and with it, the room leaned in again. Not physically, internally, because everyone understood what was about to follow. Darius took another small step closer, placing both hands lightly on the edge of the counter, not to assert dominance, but to ground the moment. "Tell me something," he said. "If I walked in wearing a suit, would this conversation be happening?" Ethan hesitated. Just long enough. That hesitation answered everything. Darius nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming a calculation he had already completed in his mind. "That is what I thought," he said. Clara shifted again, her earlier confidence now replaced by discomfort that she could not hide. She looked at Ethan, then at Darius, then back at the screen, as if searching for something to stabilize herself against. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The system had already spoken. The truth had already settled. Darius straightened slightly, his posture relaxed but undeniable. The kind of presence that does not demand attention but commands it anyway. "This store," he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow carrying further, was built on trust. He let the words breathe for a moment. "People walk in here expecting to be seen, not judged. To be served, not measured." Each sentence unfolded with precision, not rushed, not emotional, just clear. "And today," he continued, "you did not break policy. You broke that." Ethan swallowed again, the sound barely audible, but in the silence, it carried. "We can fix this," he said quickly, the urgency now impossible to hide. "We can make this right." Darius looked at him for a long moment, not dismissive, not angry, just assessing. "No," he said finally. "We cannot fix this." The finality in his tone did not come from volume. It came from certainty, a certainty that did not need agreement. Clara's eyes widened slightly, understanding what that meant before it was said. The customer recording shifted their grip, steadying for what was coming next. The room felt it again. That shift. Not tension this time. Resolution. Darius reached for his phone again, lifting it with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He tapped once, then brought it to his ear. "Carla," he said, his voice even, controlled, the name carrying a different kind of authority now. There was no delay. The response came immediately, clear, professional. "Yes, Mr. Coleman." Every head in the room tilted slightly, not out of curiosity, but recognition. This was not a personal call. This was structure, system, accountability. Darius's eyes remained on Ethan as he spoke. Initiate executive review for Store 14, he said. Effective immediately. A pause. Not from uncertainty, but from confirmation. Understood, the voice on the other end replied. Do you want to proceed with disciplinary action? The question did not shock anyone. It settled into the room like something expected, something earned. Darius did not answer immediately. He gave the moment space. Not for himself. For Ethan. For Clara. For everyone watching. Because this was not just about consequence. It was about understanding. Yes, he said finally. One word. Clean. Direct. Irreversible. Ethan's posture shifted again, this time visibly. Not dramatic. Not collapsing. But the structure that had held him upright just minutes ago was no longer there. Mr. Coleman, please, he said, stepping slightly forward, his voice no longer controlled, but careful. This is not necessary. Darius lowered the phone slightly, but did not end the call. It was necessary when you decided who I was, he replied. The words were not harsh. They were accurate, and that made them heavier. Clara took a small step back, her hand brushing against the counter as if to steady herself. The security guard near the entrance remained still, no longer part of the situation, just a witness to it. Darius brought the phone back to his ear. Terminate managerial access for Ethan Whitmore, he said. Effective now. There was no hesitation on the other end. Confirmed, the voice replied. And just like that, a soft sound came from the system behind the counter. A single tone. Not loud. Not dramatic. But final. Ethan turned instinctively toward the screen. His access badge, still clipped neatly to his jacket, blinked once. Then again. Then turned red. The meaning was immediate. Not symbolic. Functional. His authority in that space was gone. Not reduced. Not suspended. Gone. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. The silence that followed was louder than any reaction. Darius ended the call slowly, placing the phone back in his pocket with the same calm control he had shown from the start. He looked at Ethan one last time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. You did not lose your position because of me, he said. You lost it because of what you chose to see when I walked through that door. The sentence settled into the room like something permanent, something that would not leave when the moment ended. Clara lowered her head, unable to meet either of their eyes. The customer recording lowered their phone slightly, not because the moment was over, but because it had reached something deeper than footage. And Darius, without another word, turned his attention back to the display case, to the bracelet that had started it all, as if the story was not about the conflict, but about what remained after it. The bracelet had not moved. It rested in the same place beneath the glass, untouched, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for the room to catch up to it. Darius looked down at it again, not as a customer anymore, but as someone revisiting a moment that had already said everything it needed to say. The diamonds reflected the overhead lights, steady and consistent, unlike the atmosphere around them, which had shifted completely. Behind the counter, Ethan Whitmore stood frozen in a position that no longer belonged to him. His badge still glowed red, a quiet signal that needed no explanation. He did not reach for it. He did not remove it. He just stood there, as if acknowledging it would make it more real. Clara remained beside him, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer a shared position of authority. It was distance, a separation created not by movement, but by realization. She glanced at the bracelet, then at Darius, then down at her own hands, as if replaying every second that had led to this point. The customers did not leave. That was the first sign that something deeper had taken hold. People who had come in for purchases now stayed for truth. They stood quietly, not interrupting, not reacting loudly, but present in a way that made the moment heavier. The man who had been recording slowly lowered his phone, not because the story had ended, but because it had moved beyond something that needed capturing. It was something that needed understanding. Darius reached toward the display again, this time without hesitation, and the room did not react the way it had before. No one stepped forward. No one corrected him. No one questioned it. His fingers rested lightly against the glass, not even touching the bracelet, just close enough to acknowledge it. This piece, he said quietly, almost to himself, was part of the original line. His voice carried, not because it was loud, but because the room was listening differently now. Clara looked up, surprised, her attention shifting from the system to him. "Original line?" she asked, her voice smaller than before, stripped of its earlier certainty. Darius nodded slightly, his eyes still on the bracelet. "First collection we launched when the company was still operating out of a single showroom," he said. "Back when every sale mattered because there were not many of them." The words settled into the space with a different kind of weight. Not conflict. Not correction. History. Clara swallowed, her posture changing subtly as she stepped a little closer, not out of authority, but curiosity. "I did not know that," she admitted quietly. Darius glanced at her briefly, not judging, just acknowledging. "Most people do not," he said, "because they only see what is in front of them." The sentence lingered, not as criticism, but as reflection. Ethan shifted slightly, the movement small but noticeable. "Mr. Coleman," he said again, his voice lower now, less controlled, more careful. "I understand what happened, and I take responsibility." The words were different this time. Not defensive, not dismissive, but they came too late to change anything. Darius turned his head just enough to look at him. "Do you?" he asked. Not sharply, not aggressively, just clearly. Ethan nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Yes," he said. "I should have handled it differently." Darius held his gaze for a moment, then shook his head once. "That is not what I asked," he replied. The distinction landed immediately. Clara looked between them, sensing the difference. Ethan hesitated, the answer no longer as simple as he wanted it to be. "Then what are you asking?" he said. Darius straightened slightly, stepping away from the display now, creating a small distance that felt intentional. "I am asking if you understand why it happened," he said. The question settled into the room, heavier than anything that had been said before. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, the answer not coming as easily as he expected. Because this was not about procedure, not about training, not about policy. It was about something deeper, something that could not be corrected with a single sentence. Clara looked down again, her expression tightening as the realization reached her before it reached him. "It was not just a mistake," she said quietly, almost to herself. Darius nodded slightly. "No," he said. "It was not." The room absorbed that, not with shock, but with recognition, the kind that does not come from surprise, but from familiarity. The security guard near the entrance shifted again, his posture more relaxed now, no longer positioned to act, but to witness. One of the customers, a woman near the engagement display, stepped a little closer, not to interrupt, but to listen more clearly. Darius looked back at the bracelet one last time, then returned his focus to Ethan. "You saw me and made a decision," he said. "Not based on what I said, not based on what I did, based on what you thought I represented." Ethan lowered his gaze, the weight of the words settling in fully now. "I see that," he said quietly. Darius watched him for a moment, measuring not the words, but the understanding behind them. "Then remember it," he said, "because this does not end here." The sentence did not sound like a threat. It sounded like direction, like something that extended beyond the room, beyond the moment, into something larger. Clara looked up again, her expression different now, no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, but attentive. "What happens next?" she asked softly. Darius turned slightly toward her, his tone steady. "That depends on what you do with what you just saw," he said. The answer did not give instructions. It gave responsibility. And in that moment, the store felt different again. Not tense, not heavy, but changed. Not because something had been removed, but because something had been revealed. And once something is revealed clearly enough, it does not go back to being invisible. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something had shifted too deeply for that. The air inside the store felt different now, not tense, not heavy, but aware. Every person standing there carried a new understanding, whether they wanted to or not. Darius remained near the display, his posture unchanged, but his presence now filled the space in a way it had not before. Not because he demanded it, but because it had finally been recognized. Clara stood still for a moment longer, then slowly moved behind the counter, her steps more careful now, as if the floor itself required more respect than before. She looked at the system screen again, at the name that had rewritten the last several minutes, then back at Darius. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady but quieter than it had ever been. "Would you like me to assist you with the bracelet?" The question was simple, But everything about it had changed. It was no longer a correction. It was no longer a boundary. It was an offer. Darius looked at her, studying not just the words, but the tone behind them. Then he nodded once. Yes, he said. Clara reached for the case key with a level of precision that bordered on ceremony. She unlocked the display carefully, lifting the glass as if it mattered now in a way it had not minutes ago. Her movements were slower, intentional, aware. She picked up the bracelet and placed it gently on the velvet pad, then stepped slightly to the side, giving him space instead of controlling it. Darius looked down at the piece again, this time without interruption, without commentary, without assumption surrounding him. Just quiet. Just access. He picked it up, turning it slightly in the light, examining the craftsmanship with a familiarity that did not need explanation. The diamonds caught the overhead glow, reflecting steady, consistent, unbothered by everything that had just happened around them. This one sold out in the first 3 weeks when we released it, he said, almost casually. Clara nodded, listening carefully. It is one of our most requested pieces, she replied. The words came naturally now, but they carried a different weight. They were no longer rehearsed lines. They were part of a conversation she was finally having correctly. Behind her, Ethan remained in place, but the distance between him and the interaction had grown. He was no longer part of the exchange. He was outside of it, watching something. He once controlled continue without him. The customers remained where they were, but their presence had softened. They were no longer waiting for conflict. They were witnessing correction, a quiet shift from something broken to something being rebuilt in real time. Darius placed the bracelet back on the velvet pad gently, not as rejection, but as completion of the moment. I will take it, he said. Clara nodded immediately, but this time without urgency, without performance. Just professionalism, clear and steady. Of course, she said. She moved to prepare the purchase, her hands steady now, each motion deliberate, grounded in a new understanding of what her role actually meant. Service, not judgment, not assumption. Darius stepped back slightly, giving her space to work, his eyes briefly scanning the room again. Not to assess, not to measure, but to observe what remained after everything had been stripped away. The store looked the same. The displays had not changed. The lighting remained perfect, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Near the entrance, the security guard stood straighter, not out of tension, but awareness. One of the customers who had been recording lowered their phone completely now, slipping it back into their pocket. The moment no longer needed documentation. It had already imprinted itself on everyone present. Clara returned with the bracelet packaged carefully, placing it on the counter in front of Darius with both hands, a gesture that carried more respect than any words she could have used. Whenever you are ready, she said. Darius reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple card. No display. No emphasis. He placed it on the counter just as calmly as he had placed his phone earlier. Clara took it, processing the payment without hesitation, her focus entirely on the task, but her awareness still anchored in the lesson unfolding around her. The system approved the transaction instantly. Of course it did. It always would have. That had never been the question. She handed the card back with care, meeting his eyes briefly, not with fear, not with guilt, but with understanding. Thank you, she said. The words were simple, but this time, they meant exactly what they were supposed to mean. Darius took the bag, nodding once in acknowledgement. Not dismissive, not distant, just complete. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the store one last time. Not to judge, not to inspect, but to confirm something, that the space still had the potential to be what it was meant to be. And then his eyes landed on Ethan. The silence between them returned, but it was different now. Not charged, not confrontational, just clear. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his voice careful, measured, stripped of everything it had relied on before. I understand, he said. It was not a defense. It was not a request. It was a statement. Darius looked at him for a moment, then shook his head once, slowly. You are starting to, he replied. The distinction was quiet, but unmistakable. He did not wait for a response. He did not need one. Because this was not about closure. It was about consequence. And consequence did not always come with resolution. Darius turned toward the exit, his steps steady, unhurried, carrying the same calm presence he had walked in with. But now, the space responded differently. No one questioned him. No one watched with suspicion. The door opened as he approached, the city beyond visible through the glass, unchanged, moving, unaware of what had just happened inside. He paused for just a fraction of a second at the threshold, not to hesitate, but to let the moment settle one final time. Then he stepped out, leaving behind a store that looked the same, but would never operate the same way again. And inside, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of reflection, of something that could not be undone. Because once a truth is seen clearly enough, it does not disappear. It stays, and it changes everything that comes after it. The door closed softly behind Darius, but the sound carried further than it should have, echoing through the showroom like the final note of something that had already changed its shape. Inside, no one moved right away. The store remained still, not because it was empty, but because everyone inside understood that what had just happened was not finished. It had only shifted locations. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the polished surface, her reflection staring back at her with a clarity she had not seen before. The system screen had dimmed back to its normal display, but the name that had appeared on it still lingered in her mind, repeating itself in quiet intervals. Darius Coleman. Founder. Owner. Not as a title. As a reminder. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, but the space around him no longer responded the same way. The authority he had carried into the moment had not just been removed. It had been replaced by something else. Something quieter. Something heavier. He reached up slowly and unclipped his badge, holding it in his hand for a moment as if it might explain itself if he looked at it long enough. The red light had already faded, but the meaning had not. Clara glanced at him briefly, then looked away, not out of avoidance, but because she did not know where to place him anymore. He was no longer her manager. He was not yet anything else. And that space between identities made everything uncertain. A customer near the engagement display stepped forward slightly, breaking the silence in the only way it could be broken now. That was not just about him, she said quietly, more to the room than to anyone specific. Her voice carried just enough to reach Clara. Clara nodded without thinking, the response instinctive, pulled from something deeper than training. No, she said softly. It was not. The words felt different leaving her mouth. Not rehearsed. Not safe. Real. Another customer, the man who had been recording earlier, spoke up next, his tone thoughtful, not confrontational. You all saw him the same way I did at first, he said. But he did not change. What changed was what we knew. The sentence settled into the room, filling the space where assumptions had been just minutes ago. Clara looked down at the counter again, her fingers tracing the edge of the velvet pad where the bracelet had been placed. We should have known without needing to know, she said quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavy. He placed the badge on the counter, not tossing it, not discarding it, just setting it down as if it still deserved a level of care, even now. We should have seen him, he added. The admission did not come easily, but it came honestly, and that made it matter. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight, stepping slightly forward now, not to intervene, but to be part of the moment in a different way. It happens more than people think, he said, his voice low, measured. People get red before they get heard. Clara lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze for a brief second, understanding passing between them without explanation. The store, which had once felt like a place defined by its displays and lighting, now felt defined by something else entirely. Awareness. Not loud, not overwhelming, just present. The kind that does not leave once it arrives. Clara straightened slightly, her posture adjusting, not back to what it was before, but into something new, something more intentional. She looked around the showroom, at the displays, at the customers, at the space itself, and then back at Ethan. What happens now? She asked. The question was not directed at authority anymore. It was directed at responsibility. Ethan looked at the badge on the counter, then at the door where Darius had exited, then back at Clara. Now, he said slowly, we decide if that moment changes anything. The answer did not solve anything. It opened something. And that was enough. Clara nodded once, then moved from behind the counter, stepping out onto the showroom floor in a way she had not before. Not as someone guarding a space, but as someone part of it. She approached the customers who had stayed, her voice steady, grounded. If anyone needs assistance, I am here, she said. The sentence was simple, but this time, it meant exactly what it said. The customers did not rush. They did not react dramatically. They simply acknowledged it, some with nods, some with quiet expressions that carried more than words. The energy in the room shifted again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something new. Outside, beyond the glass doors, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside those walls. People walked by, traffic moved, life carried on. But inside, something had been reset. Not the store, not the system, the perspective. Ethan picked up the badge again, turning it over in his hand, then placing it in his pocket, not as a reclaiming of authority, but as an acknowledgement of what had been lost. He looked at Clara one last time, then at the showroom, then toward the back office. "I will be in the office," he said quietly. Clara nodded, but did not follow. She stayed where she was, on the floor, present, engaged, aware. Because that was where the change needed to happen. Not behind a desk, not behind a system. Right there, in the space where people walked in expecting to be treated as if they mattered. And for the first time since the day had started, the store felt like it might actually become that place. The office door closed behind Ethan with a softer sound than expected, but it still carried through the store like a quiet separation from everything that had just unfolded. Inside the showroom, the movement resumed, but not in the way it had before. It was slower, more deliberate, like every step now had to pass through a layer of awareness before it reached the floor. Clara stood near the center of the space, no longer anchored behind the counter, her posture open, her attention present in a way it had never been earlier that day. A couple approached her cautiously, not unsure of her role, but aware that something about the environment had changed. "We were looking at engagement rings," the man said, his tone polite but measured. Clara nodded immediately, her response natural, unforced. "I would be happy to help you," she said. No hesitation, no scanning, no silent calculation, just service. As she guided them toward the display, her movements reflected something new, not rehearsed, but understood. She did not lead from distance anymore. She stood beside them, explaining options, answering questions, but more importantly, listening, truly listening. And that difference, though subtle, reshaped the interaction completely. Nearby, the security guard adjusted his stance again, no longer positioned as a silent observer of risk, but as part of a space that no longer needed to categorize people before they even spoke. He watched the room not for threats, but for flow, for balance, for something closer to what the store was meant to be. One of the customers who had remained stepped toward another display, running a hand lightly along the edge of the glass, not touching the items inside, but appreciating the space differently now. The man who had recorded earlier leaned against a column briefly, looking around, not at the jewelry, but at the people. "It feels different," he said quietly, almost to himself. And it did. The lighting had not changed. The layout remained the same. But the atmosphere had shifted into something that could not be seen directly, only felt. Behind the closed office door, Ethan stood still, his hand resting on the edge of his desk, his reflection faintly visible in the glass panel. The office was quiet, insulated from the showroom, but not separate from it. The moment outside had followed him in, settling into the space like something that would not leave until it was understood. He looked at the desk, at the files, at the systems that had once responded instantly to his commands, and then down at his hands. For years, those hands had moved through this space with certainty, making decisions quickly, confidently, without hesitation. And now, that certainty felt misplaced, like something that had been built on an incomplete foundation. He sat down slowly, the chair adjusting beneath him, but even that small motion felt different. He was no longer sitting in control. He was sitting in reflection. The silence in the office was not empty. It was filled with the replay of every second that had led to this moment. The words, the tone, the assumptions, each one clearer now than it had been when it was spoken. And clarity, once it arrives, does not soften the truth. It sharpens it. Outside, Clara continued assisting the couple, her voice steady, her explanations clear, but her attention always returning to something deeper than the transaction itself. The woman trying on a ring looked up at her, a small smile forming. "Thank you," she said. Clara returned the smile, not as a response, but as a recognition. "Of course," she replied. And this time, the words carried weight. Not because of what they said, but because of what they did not hide. The customers who had stayed began to move again, not rushing, not eager, but engaged. The store had not lost its purpose. It had refined it. Each interaction now carried a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and that awareness shaped everything without needing to announce itself. Near the entrance, the door opened again, letting in a brief rush of city noise before closing softly behind a new customer. The person paused for a moment, looking around, taking in the space. For a second, it was the same as it had always been. A high-end jewelry store. Polished, precise, controlled. But then something else appeared in the way the staff moved, in the way the space held itself, in the way attention was given without judgment. And that difference, though small, was enough to change the experience entirely. Inside the office, Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for a moment, not to escape, but to process. The position he had held, the authority he had exercised, the decisions he had made, all of it had been built on something he had never fully questioned. Until now. He opened his eyes again, looking at the door, knowing that everything outside it had changed, and that he could not return to it as the same person who had walked out earlier. Because that version no longer fit the reality he now understood. And outside, Clara adjusted the display gently, resetting the velvet pad after the couple moved on, her movements calm, precise, intentional. Not just maintaining the store, maintaining something else. Something that had finally been seen clearly enough to matter. The store did not need to announce that it had changed. It showed it. In every interaction. In every pause. In every moment where someone was no longer measured before they were heard. And that was how real change began. Not with noise. Not with declarations. But with awareness that stayed long after the moment that created it had passed. The rhythm of the store continued, but it was no longer automatic. Every movement now carried intention, as if the space itself had learned something it refused to forget. Clara stood near the center display, adjusting a row of bracelets with careful precision, her fingers steady but her mind still echoing with the moments that had just passed. The name had not left her thoughts, not because of its power, but because of what it had revealed about her own. She paused briefly, looking at her reflection in the glass, not to check her appearance, but to recognize something that had shifted beneath it. A customer approached, a middle-aged man in a simple jacket, his posture relaxed but observant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm. "Could you show me something in white gold?" Clara turned immediately, her response smooth but different now, grounded. "Of course," she said, stepping beside him instead of in front of him. She did not scan him. She did not calculate. She simply listened. And that difference, though invisible, reshaped the interaction before it even began. As she opened the display, her movements were steady, respectful, but, more importantly, aware. Not aware of status. Not aware of appearance. Aware of presence. She placed a selection in front of him, explaining the pieces clearly, but leaving space for him to engage on his own terms. The man nodded, appreciating the tone as much as the jewelry. "Thank you," he said after a moment. Clara returned the nod, her expression calm. "You are welcome," she replied, and this time, the words carried no distance at all. Across the store, the energy continued to settle into this new rhythm. Customers moved naturally, no longer glancing around for tension, no longer pausing to interpret the atmosphere. It simply felt open, not because anything had been announced, but because something had been corrected. Near the entrance, the security guard stood with a different posture now, not rigid, not reactive, but present. His attention moved with the flow of people, not against it, and that subtle shift changed how the space responded to him as well. He was no longer a barrier. He was part of the environment. Behind the closed office door, Ethan remained seated, but he had not been still. He had moved through every version of the moment in his mind, each replay sharper than the last. The words he had used earlier now sounded different when heard without the confidence that had once supported them. They sounded smaller, not because they were quiet, but because they had been built on something incomplete. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, as if holding on to something that had not yet fully formed. The idea of authority had always been clear to him. Structure, control, decision-making. But now, that idea felt unfinished, missing something that had been right in front of him the entire time. Respect without condition. Not after verification. Not after confirmation. From the start. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but realization. Outside, Clara finished assisting the customer, closing the display with a gentle motion that felt more like completion than routine. She stepped back, allowing him space, not directing his next move, just supporting it if needed. The customer lingered for a moment, then looked at her again. "It feels different in here," he said. Clara paused, the statement landing deeper than a compliment. She nodded slightly. "It is," she replied. She did not explain it. She did not need to, because the difference could not be described fully. It could only be experienced. The man smiled faintly, then continued browsing, his attention relaxed, unguarded. Clara watched him for a moment, then turned her gaze across the store again, noticing how each interaction now carried a level of awareness that had not been there before. Not forced, not exaggerated, just present. The kind of presence that changes behavior without needing instruction. Near the far display, a young woman examined a set of earrings, her expression thoughtful. Clara approached her calmly. "Would you like to try those?" she asked. The woman looked up, surprised slightly, not by the question, but by the tone. "Yes," she said. Clara opened the case, handing her the earrings carefully, then stepped back, allowing her to explore them without pressure. The interaction unfolded naturally, without interruption, without assumption. And that was the difference. It was not about doing more. It was about removing what had been in the way. Inside the office, Ethan stood up slowly, the decision forming not as a reaction, but as a response. He walked toward the door, pausing for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but awareness. He knew that stepping back into the showroom meant stepping into something that required more than position. It required change. He opened the door quietly and stepped out. The noise of the store met him again, but it did not sound the same. It was lighter, more balanced. He looked around, observing the interactions, the movements, the tone. Everything was familiar, and yet, everything had shifted. Clara noticed him first, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no tension there, no confrontation, just acknowledgement. Ethan walked forward slowly, not reclaiming space, but entering it differently. He stopped near the center, watching as Clara assisted another customer, her approach steady, consistent, respectful. He saw the difference clearly now, not because it had been explained, because it was visible, in tone, in posture, in presence. He exhaled again, quieter this time, then spoke, not loudly, not authoritatively, but clearly enough to be heard by those nearby. "If anyone needs assistance, I am available as well," he said. The words were simple, but this time, they were not backed by assumption. They were offered with understanding. The room did not react dramatically. It did not need to. The change was already in motion, and as the store continued to move forward in this new rhythm, it became clear that what had happened earlier was not an interruption. It was a correction, one that would continue to shape every moment that followed, long after the memory of how it started began to fade. The store no longer felt like it was recovering. It felt like it was redefining itself in real time. The difference was subtle to anyone walking in from the outside, but to those who had witnessed what happened, every detail now carried a second layer of meaning. Clara moved through the space with quiet confidence, not the kind that comes from certainty and rules, but the kind that comes from clarity and purpose. She no longer stood behind the counter waiting for customers to approach. She moved among them, present, attentive, aware of each interaction before it even began. A young couple near the center display exchanged glances as she approached, their hesitation fading almost instantly. "Take your time," Clara said softly. "I am here if you need anything." The words were simple, but they did something powerful. They removed pressure. They removed judgment. They replaced expectation with invitation. And the couple responded without even realizing it, their shoulders relaxing, their voices softening, their attention turning back to each other instead of the space around them. Across the showroom, Ethan moved differently as well. His steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he was learning the floor again. He did not stand in the center. He did not command attention. He observed. He listened. And when he spoke, it was measured, grounded in something that had not been present before. A customer near the watch display looked up as Ethan approached. "Can you tell me more about this piece?" the man asked. Ethan nodded, stepping closer, but not too close. "Of course," he said. His voice was steady, but it carried a new awareness. He did not lead with price. He did not assume interest. He explained the craftsmanship, the materials, the history behind the design, allowing the customer to guide the conversation instead of controlling it. And that shift, though small, changed everything. The man nodded, engaged, no longer feeling evaluated, only informed. Near the entrance, the security guard continued to hold his position, but his role had evolved. He no longer watched people as they entered with suspicion. He acknowledged them with a slight nod, a neutral but welcoming gesture that did not categorize, did not assess, did not predefine. And in return, people entered differently. Not cautiously, not defensively, just normally, as they should have from the beginning. The energy in the store had settled into something steady now. Not heightened, not fragile, just balanced. The kind of balance that does not need to be maintained constantly because it has finally found its center. Clara paused near the bracelet display again, her eyes resting on the space where the original piece had been. It was empty now, replaced by a subtle indentation in the velvet that had not yet been smoothed over. She reached out and adjusted it gently, restoring the surface, but not erasing the memory. Because that space now represented something more than inventory. It represented a moment that had forced clarity into a place that had operated without questioning itself for too long. A customer nearby noticed her movement. Was something there? The woman asked casually. Clara smiled slightly. Yes, she said. Something important. The answer was simple, but it carried layers that did not need to be explained. The woman nodded, not pressing further, but sensing that the meaning extended beyond the object itself. Behind them, the system continued to operate as it always had, processing transactions, tracking inventory, maintaining order. But even that felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because the people using it had. The system had always been accurate. It had always been fair. The difference had never been in the technology. It had been in the interpretation. And now, that interpretation had shifted. Ethan stepped back slightly after finishing with the customer, allowing space for the man to consider his options without pressure. He watched as the customer continued to examine the watch, engaged, comfortable, unguarded. And for the first time, Ethan saw clearly what had been missing before. Not efficiency, not professionalism, but respect without condition. Not after confirmation, not after validation. From the beginning, he exhaled slowly, the realization settling into him fully now. Clara moved past him briefly, their paths crossing without tension. For a moment, they paused, not out of necessity, but acknowledgement. It is different, Ethan said quietly. Clara nodded. It is supposed to be, she replied. The exchange was brief, but it held more weight than any discussion they could have had earlier. It was not about agreement. It was about understanding. Across the store, the customers continued their experience, unaware of the full depth of what had changed, but benefiting from it in every interaction. The couple near the center display laughed softly as they compared options, their conversation easy, unburdened. The man at the watch display nodded to himself, clearly finding something he connected with. The young woman, trying on earrings, smiled at her reflection, not distracted by the space around her, fully present in the moment. And that was the difference. The store no longer influenced how people felt about themselves. It supported it. The door opened again, letting in another wave of movement from the city outside. New customers stepped in, unaware of the moment that had reshaped the space just minutes before. But they did not need to know, because the result was already there, embedded in every interaction, every tone, every gesture. Clara looked toward the entrance briefly, then back across the store, her posture steady, her awareness constant. She did not need to remind herself of what had happened. It had already become part of how she moved. Ethan stood near the back now, not removed, but integrated differently. He was no longer the center of authority. He was part of the system, part of the environment, part of the change that had begun. And for the first time, that felt correct. Not diminished, not reduced, aligned. The store continued to operate, but it was no longer just functioning. It was evolving, not through policy, not through instruction, but through understanding that had been forced into the open and could no longer be ignored. And as the day moved forward, the difference remained. Quiet, steady, permanent. Because once a space learns to see clearly, it does not return to looking the same way again. By the time the afternoon light shifted slightly across the showroom floor, the store had fully settled into its new rhythm, but what made it different was not the pace or the flow of customers. It was the awareness that now lived inside every interaction, quiet but constant, like something that had finally been named and could no longer be ignored. Clara stood near the center display once again, but this time her posture carried a kind of grounded confidence that did not rely on position or authority. It came from understanding. Not perfect understanding, not complete, but enough to change how she moved, how she spoke, how she saw. A woman approached her slowly, holding a small jewelry box in her hand, her expression thoughtful. "I bought this here a few months ago," she said. "I just wanted to ask about resizing." Clara nodded immediately, her attention focused fully on the woman, not the object, not the transaction, but the person. "Of course," she said gently. "Let me take a look for you." She accepted the box carefully, opening it with a level of attention that reflected more than just professionalism. She listened as the woman explained, not interrupting, not redirecting, simply present. And that presence, though quiet, created something that could be felt instantly. The woman's shoulders relaxed, her voice steadied, her experience shifting from cautious to comfortable without needing to ask for it. Across the store, Ethan observed the interaction from a distance, not stepping in, not directing, just watching. He could see the difference clearly now, not in what Clara was doing, but in how she was doing it. There was no barrier in her tone, no filter of assumption, just engagement. And that difference changed everything about how the moment unfolded. He turned slightly, scanning the rest of the showroom, noticing how each staff member, each customer, each movement now carried that same quiet adjustment. Not forced, not instructed, learned. And once learned, it did not require constant effort. It became part of the way the space functioned. Near the entrance, a young man stepped inside, pausing for a brief moment as his eyes adjusted to the lighting. He wore simple clothes, nothing that signaled status, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, this time, no one reacted differently. No one watched him longer than necessary. No one adjusted their tone before he even spoke. He was simply another customer entering the store, as it should have always been. Clara noticed him, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, not intrusive, not performative, just present. The young man nodded back, moving toward a display without hesitation because there was nothing in the space telling him to feel otherwise. That alone marked the difference. Ethan watched that moment carefully, recognizing its importance more than anything else that had happened that day. Not because it was dramatic, because it was normal. And normal, in this case, was what had been missing all along. He stepped forward slightly, not to approach the young man, but to be available, his posture open, his presence neutral. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, his voice calm, steady, free of assumption. The young man glanced up briefly, then nodded. "Thanks," he replied. The exchange lasted only a second, but it carried a different kind of weight. No evaluation, no hesitation, just interaction. Clara finished assisting the woman with the jewelry box, explaining the resizing process clearly, offering options, answering questions without rushing. When she handed the piece back, the woman smiled, a genuine expression of appreciation that came from feeling understood, not managed. "I am glad I came back," she said softly. Clara returned the smile. "We are glad you did," she replied. And for the first time, the phrase felt complete. Not scripted, not expected, true. The woman left the store with a lighter step than she had entered, and Clara watched her for a moment, not to track her movement, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place within that simple interaction. Because that was where change lived now. Not in statements, not in systems. In moments like that, Ethan moved closer to the counter, his eyes briefly landing on the spot where the bracelet had once been displayed. The velvet was smooth again, the space restored, but he knew what had happened there would not be erased. Not from him, not from the store. He placed his hand lightly on the counter, not as a claim, but as a connection, grounding himself in the present version of the space, not the one he had operated in before. Clara joined him briefly, standing beside him, both of them looking out across the showroom. "It is quieter," Ethan said after a moment. Clara nodded slightly. "Not quieter," she corrected gently. "Clearer." The distinction was small, but it mattered, because the noise that had existed before had not been sound. It had been assumption. And now that it was gone, what remained felt different, even if it looked the same. Ethan exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper with each passing minute. I thought I understood what this place needed, he said quietly. Clara did not respond immediately. She let the words sit, then turned slightly toward him. Now you are starting to, she said. There was no judgment in her tone, no correction, just acknowledgement. And that made the difference. The store continued to move, customers flowing in and out, interactions unfolding naturally, without friction, without tension. The city outside remained unchanged, but inside, something had aligned in a way that could not be undone. Because once a space learns to see people as they are, not as they are assumed to be, it does not forget that lesson. It carries it forward, shaping everything that follows, quietly, consistently, permanently. By the time the evening light began to soften against the glass storefront, the store no longer carried any trace of the tension that had once defined it earlier that day. But what replaced it was not forgetfulness. It was memory transformed into behavior, into awareness, into something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Clara stood near the front now, not stationed, not assigned, but present by choice. Her posture relaxed yet attentive, her eyes moving naturally across the room without searching for anything specific, only ensuring that no one went unseen. A new group of customers entered, their voices low, their movements casual, unaware that the space they had just stepped into had already been rewritten before they arrived. Clara greeted them with a simple nod and a calm, welcoming tone, not rehearsed, not exaggerated, just genuine. Good evening, she said. And the greeting landed differently than it would have hours before, not as an introduction to a transaction, but as an invitation into a space that now knew how to hold people without measuring them first. The group responded naturally, one of them stepping forward to ask about a necklace display near the back. Clara guided them without hesitation, her pace matching theirs, not leading, not controlling, simply accompanying. And in that subtle shift, the entire interaction unfolded differently, free of pressure, free of silent evaluation. Across the store, Ethan stood near the side display, watching not as a supervisor, but as someone learning from what he had once overlooked. His presence was quieter now, but more intentional, every movement shaped by an awareness that had not existed before. A customer approached him, an older gentleman with a calm demeanor and steady voice. "Can you tell me about this collection?" he asked. Ethan nodded, stepping beside him, not across from him. "Of course," he said. And as he spoke, there was no trace of assumption in his tone, no filtering of the customer before the conversation began, just information, respect, and space for the man to engage on his own terms. The explanation flowed naturally, not scripted, not controlled, and the customer responded in kind, asking questions, sharing preferences, becoming part of the interaction rather than being guided through it. Near the entrance, the security guard continued his quiet watch, but even that role had softened into something more human, more integrated into the space. He acknowledged each person who entered with the same neutral respect, not weighing them, not categorizing them, simply recognizing their presence. And in return, people moved through the doorway without hesitation, without the subtle tension that often comes from being observed too closely before being understood. Clara paused briefly near the bracelet display once more, her eyes settling on the spot that had once held the piece Darius had chosen. The velvet was smooth, the arrangement restored, but the meaning remained. She reached out and adjusted a nearby piece slightly, not because it needed correction, but because she was present enough to notice it. That was the difference now. Not reaction, but awareness. A young woman approached her again, holding a small bag from another store, her expression curious. "Is this where I can find custom pieces?" she asked. Clara smiled gently. "Yes," she said. "What are you looking for?" The conversation began without hesitation, without pause, and as the woman explained, Clara listened fully, not preparing her response before the sentence ended, not redirecting the conversation, simply hearing her. And that alone created something that could not be manufactured. Trust. Across the room, Ethan finished assisting his customer, stepping back to allow the man space to consider his options. He watched as the customer remained engaged, comfortable, unguarded, and in that moment, Ethan understood something that had never been clear before. Respect was not something that followed service. It was something that made service possible. Without it, everything else was just performance. He exhaled slowly, not with relief, but with clarity, the kind that settles in quietly and stays. Clara crossed paths with him again, their movements intersecting briefly. "We are holding it differently now," Ethan said, his voice low but certain. Clara nodded. "We are seeing it differently," she replied. And the distinction mattered. Because nothing physical had changed. The displays, the lighting, the inventory, all of it remained exactly the same. What had changed was perception. And perception, once corrected, reshaped everything without needing to touch it. The customers continued to move through the space, some making purchases, some simply browsing, but all of them experiencing something that felt natural, unforced, consistent. No one stood out for the wrong reasons. No one was evaluated before being heard. The store had not lowered its standards. It had refined them. Outside, the city moved into evening, the lights beginning to glow against the glass, reflections layering over the showroom in a quiet blend of movement and stillness. Inside, the store held its balance, not fragile, not temporary, but grounded in something that no longer depended on assumption to function. Clara stepped back slightly, taking in the room as a whole, not to monitor, not to control, but to understand. And what she saw was not perfection. It was alignment. A space that finally matched what it was meant to represent. Ethan stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking out across the showroom without speaking. There was no need for explanation. The change had already spoken for itself. And as the evening settled in, the store did not return to what it had been. It moved forward as something else entirely. Something clearer. Something more honest. Something that no longer needed to decide who belonged before offering them a place to stand. By the time the last stretch of evening settled into the city and the soft glow of streetlights began reflecting across the glass storefront, the jewelry store no longer felt like a place that had simply gone through a moment. It felt like a place that had absorbed it, reshaped itself around it, and chosen not to forget. The movement inside had slowed, not from lack of business, but from a quiet sense of completion that had replaced the earlier tension. Customers who remained moved with ease, their conversations unguarded, their presence natural, as if the space no longer required them to adjust themselves before stepping fully into it. Clara stood near the entrance again, not positioned there out of duty, but because she understood now that the first moment someone enters a space often decides everything that follows. A couple walked in, pausing briefly as their eyes adjusted to the light, their expressions neutral, open. Clara met them with a simple, steady acknowledgement. "Good evening," she said. No hesitation, no evaluation, just presence. The couple responded without tension, stepping further inside, their attention shifting naturally toward the displays instead of the room itself. That was the difference. The space no longer asked anything of them before offering something back. Across the showroom, Ethan stood near the main display, but not at its center. He no longer occupied the position as if it belonged to him. Instead, he moved within it, aware of it, aligned with it. A customer approached him with a quiet question about a watch, and Ethan responded with the same steady tone he had learned throughout the day, not directing, not assuming, simply informing. The conversation unfolded without friction, and when the customer nodded in appreciation, it did not feel like success. It felt like correctness, like something finally functioning the way it should have all along. Near the bracelet display, the space where Darius had once stood remained visually unchanged, but its meaning lingered like a quiet imprint beneath the surface. Clara glanced toward it briefly, not out of fixation, but recognition. That moment had not just changed the way the store operated. It had changed the way she saw herself within it. Not as someone who managed access, but as someone who ensured it. The difference was subtle, but it was everything. The security guard near the entrance adjusted his position slightly, his posture relaxed yet attentive, no longer acting as a filter, but as a presence that contributed to the environment instead of controlling it. He nodded to a customer exiting the store, the gesture small, respectful, equal, and the customer returned it without hesitation, without discomfort, just naturally. That exchange alone held more value than any enforced protocol. Inside the office, the lights remained off. Ethan had not returned there. He no longer needed the separation. The understanding he had gained did not belong behind a door. It belonged in the open, in the space where it could shape something real. Clara moved across the showroom once more, her attention steady, her movements unforced, stopping briefly to assist a customer with a question about a necklace. Her explanation was clear, her tone balanced, but what mattered most was what she did not include. There was no assumption, no quiet measurement, just service, and that absence of bias created something that could be felt instantly, even if it could not be named. The customer smiled, not because of the product, but because of the experience. And that was the shift. The store was no longer just selling jewelry. It was offering respect. And respect, once present, changed the value of everything else. Ethan watched the interaction from a distance, not evaluating, not correcting, just observing. He saw the difference in Clara, in the customers, in the space itself. And for the first time, he understood that leadership was not about controlling outcomes. It was about shaping environments where the right outcomes could happen without force. He stepped forward slightly, offering assistance to another customer, his voice calm, grounded, free of the urgency that had once defined it. The customer responded naturally, engaging in conversation without hesitation, without guardedness. And in that moment, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not authority, alignment. The store continued to move toward closing time, but there was no rush, no sense of ending. Just a steady continuation of something that had been corrected and would now carry forward. Clara adjusted a display near the front, her movements precise but unhurried, then stepped back, taking in the room once more. The lighting, the layout, the people, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. And that was how she knew the change was real, because it did not rely on visible markers. It lived in the way the space held people now, in the way it no longer questioned their presence before acknowledging it. The final customers began to make their way toward the exit, their experiences complete, their impressions shaped not by a single moment, but by the consistency of everything that followed it. Clara thanked each of them as they left, her voice steady, her tone genuine, and each one responded in kind, not out of politeness, but because the interaction had been real. Ethan stood near the door as well, offering a quiet nod as the last customer stepped out into the evening. The door closed softly behind them, the sound no longer echoing with tension, but settling into a space that had finally found its balance. The store was quiet now, but not empty. It was full of something that did not disappear when the lights dimmed or the doors closed. It was full of understanding. Clara looked across the showroom one final time, her posture relaxed, her expression clear. Ethan stood beside her, not as a manager, not as a superior, but as someone who had learned something he would not unlearn. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to explain, because the lesson had already been lived. And as the lights lowered slightly and the city outside continued without pause, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. Respect was never something that should have required proof. It was something that should have been given from the very first moment. And now, finally, it was.